Everyone was told not to adopt this parrot, but one man did not listen. Please listen until the end to be amazed by this story. Edison stared at the brightly colored sign of Feathered Friends Aviary with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The small pet shop nestled between a coffee house and a bookstore had been recommended by a colleague, though with an unusual warning. They have a parrot there. Whatever you do, don't ask about that parrot. Of course, that was precisely why Edison was here now. His apartment had been painfully quiet since his divorce. After spending years in a home filled with conversation and laughter, the silence had become an unwelcome companion. A pet seemed like a logical solution, and Edison had always been fascinated by birds, their intelligence, their personalities, their ability to communicate. A small bell jingled as he pushed open the door. The shop was larger inside than it appeared from the street, with rows of cages containing finches, canaries, and cockatiels. Their cheerful songs created a pleasant background melody. The air smelled of seed husks and fresh cedar shavings. "Hello there! Welcome to Feathered Friends," called a voice from behind the counter. A woman with curly auburn hair approached with a warm smile. The name tag pinned to her vest read Wendy. "Hi," Edison replied. "I am looking for a companion bird. Something intelligent, something with personality." Wendy's smile brightened. "Well, you'd have come to the right place. We have several birds that might interest you. The cockatiels are wonderful companions, and we have a few young conures that—" "Actually," Edison interrupted, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, "I heard you have a parrot that no one wants to adopt." The shop fell silent. Even the birds seemed to stop their chatter. Wendy's smile faded, replaced by a guarded expression. "Who told you about Oscar?" she asked cautiously. "A friend mentioned him. Said I shouldn't to ask, which naturally made me curious." Edison shrugged. "Is there something wrong with him?" Wendy sighed, running a hand through her curly hair. "Nothing wrong with him exactly. Oscar is complicated." She hesitated, then gestured for Edison to follow her to a back room. "Come on, you might as well meet him yourself." The back room was quieter, with larger cages housing more exotic birds. In the corner stood a particularly spacious enclosure, and inside was one of the most beautiful African grey parrots Edison had ever seen. His feathers were immaculate, a soft charcoal grey with a striking crimson tail. The bird fixed Edison with an intelligent gaze, tilting his head as if appraising him. "This is Oscar," Wendy said. "He has been with us for nearly a year now. He has been returned by 4 different families." "Returned? Why?" Edison asked, moving closer to the cage. Oscar watched him with those eerily intelligent eyes. "That is the complicated part," Wendy replied, lowering her voice. "Oscar knows things he shouldn't to know, things that make people uncomfortable." Edison laughed. "What, like he reveals secrets, repeats private conversations? That is what parrots do, isn't it?" "It is more than that," Wendy said seriously. "Oscar doesn't just repeat what he hears. He understands. And he shares things at exactly the wrong or right moment, depending on how you look at it." As if on cue, Oscar ruffled his feathers and spoke in a perfectly clear voice. "Eddie's wife left because he works too much, not because of Natalie." Edison froze. He had never mentioned his wife, his work habits, or the woman his ex-wife had falsely accused him of having an affair with. He never mentioned his nickname either, Eddie. "How did he—" Edison's voice trailed off as he stared at the bird in disbelief. Wendy gave him a sympathetic look. "That's why he keeps getting returned. He says things, accurate things, that he has no way of knowing. The last family brought him back after he exposed an affair. The family before that returned him when he started talking about financial problems they hadn't told anyone about." "That's impossible," Edison whispered, still staring at Oscar. "We thought so too," Wendy agreed. "We had experts examine him. Some think he is simply exceptionally good at reading human behavior and making lucky guesses. Others believe his previous owner, a woman who passed away, somehow trained him to make these kinds of statements. His original cage came with journals filled with psychological observations. She was a therapist." Oscar tilted his head again, studying Edison with those unnerving eyes. "Eddie needs someone who understands loneliness," the parrot said softly. A chill ran down Edison's spine. There was something about the way Oscar said it, not like a parrot mimicking words, but like someone who genuinely understood what loneliness felt like. His previous owners couldn't handle it, Wendy explained. They felt like they were living with some kind of mind reader. It made them uncomfortable, having a bird that seemed to know their deepest secrets. Edison should have been unnerved, should have backed away and looked at the cockatiels instead. But something about Oscar's gaze held him there. "How much?" he asked suddenly. Wendy blinked in surprise. "You want to adopt him? Even after what you just heard?" "Especially after what I just heard him," Edison replied, surprising himself with his certainty. "I live alone. I don't have many secrets left to expose. And frankly, I could use some honest conversation." Wendy hesitated. "I should warn you, there is a reason we keep him in the back. Oscar doesn't just know things, he shares them, without filters, in public." "Sounds exactly like what I need," Edison said with a wry smile. "A truth-teller." After completing the necessary paperwork and purchasing supplies, Edison found himself driving home with Oscar's cage secured in the passenger seat. The bird had remained surprisingly quiet during the transaction, watching everything with those intelligent eyes. "So," Edison said, as they waited at a red light, feeling slightly foolish for talking to a bird, "you're coming home with me." "Home is where you make it," Oscar replied, his voice startlingly clear over the hum of the car engine. "Your apartment isn't at home yet." Edison almost swerved. "How do you know I live in an apartment?" Oscar simply preened his wing feathers, offering no explanation. By the time they arrived at Edison's third-floor apartment, he had almost convinced himself that the bird's earlier statements had been coincidences. Perhaps Wendy had researched him online before he visited the shop. Perhaps his demeanor simply screamed, "Recently divorced workaholic." The apartment was indeed not much of a home. Edison had moved in after the divorce, but had done little to personalize the space. Cardboard boxes still lined one wall of the living room, and the furniture was minimal. A couch, a coffee table, a television he rarely watched, and a desk crowded with work papers. "Well, this is it," Edison said, setting Oscar's cage on a stand by the window. "It is not much, but it has a nice view of the park." Oscar surveyed the apartment, his head swiveling to take in every corner. Then he fixed his gaze on Edison. "You should unpack those boxes," he said, "especially the one with the photos." Edison stiffened. The box with the photo albums was at the bottom of the stack, unopened since the move. He hadn't been able to face the memories they contained. "How could you possibly know about those?" he whispered. Oscar tilted his head but offered no explanation. Instead he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "Not unpacking is not moving on." Something about the simple truth of the statement struck Edison deeply. He had been living in limbo, surrounded by packed boxes, as if part of him believed this situation was temporary, that somehow, someday, he would return to his old life. That night, after setting up Oscar's cage near the window where he could see the sunset, Edison found himself pulling out the box of photo albums. He sat cross-legged on the floor, turning pages filled with images of happier times, allowing himself to feel the loss fully for the first time. Oscar watched from his cage, occasionally making soft, almost sympathetic sounds. "Were you really a therapist, S-Bird?" Edison asked, looking up from a wedding photo that now brought more nostalgia than pain. "Patricia helped people heal," Oscar replied. "She said sometimes you need to lance the wound to let the poison out." "Patricia? Was that your previous owner?" Edison asked, startled by the specific name. Oscar bobbed his head in what seemed like affirmation, then added, "She knew time was short. She taught me to see." Edison stayed up late that night, unpacking boxes while Oscar watched. With each item he placed on a shelf or hung on a wall, the apartment felt less like a temporary stop and more like a place where healing could begin. By morning, when sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air, Edison felt different, lighter somehow, as if speaking truths aloud, even through the medium of this strange knowing bird, had begun to lance wounds he'd been carefully ignoring. What Edison didn't realize was that Oscar's abilities extended far beyond simple intuition or trained responses. The Parrot's uncanny insights would soon draw him into a mystery that had been festering beneath the surface of his quiet neighborhood, a mystery that would change everything Edison thought he knew about his new companion and himself. As Edison prepared for work, adjusting his tie in the mirror, Oscar spoke again from his perch. "The woman in 2B is afraid of her husband." Edison paused, his hands still on his tie. "What did you say?" "The woman in 2B, Oscar repeated calmly. "She's afraid. You should bring her muffins." "I don't even know who lives in 2B, Edison replied, bewildered. "And why muffins?" "Neighbors should know neighbors," Oscar said simply, "especially scared ones." Edison dismissed the strange comment as he hurried out the door, late for a meeting. But the Parrot ES words lingered in his mind throughout the day, an unsettling suggestion that refused to be forgotten. Little did he know that this simple observation from his new feathered companion would be the first thread in unraveling a dangerous situation, one where Oscar's unusual abilities would prove to be much more than an unsettling party trick. Edison returned home that evening with a small box of blueberry muffins balanced on top of his briefcase. He felt ridiculous, buying baked goods for a stranger based on a Parrot's cryptic comment. Yet something about Oscar's words had nagged at him all day, making it impossible to simply ignore them. "I bought the muffins," he announced as he entered the apartment, feeling slightly foolish for addressing the bird as if they were roommates having a conversation. Oscar stopped preening his feathers and fixed Edison with that penetrating stare. "Good. She needs a friend today." Edison set his briefcase down and loosened his tie. "Look, I cannot just knock on some woman's door and offer her muffins because my parrot told me to. She'll think I am deranged." "Say you were welcoming neighbors, new to the building," Oscar suggested, his head bobbing slightly. "I've lived here for months." "She moved in last week," and Oscar countered, "while you were at the conference in Philadelphia." Edison froze. He had indeed been at a conference in Philadelphia the previous week. He hadn't mentioned it to Oscar, and there was no way the bird could have known this detail. "How do you keep doing that?" he whispered. Oscar simply tilted his head and remained silent, as if to say the mystery of his knowledge was beside the point. With a deep sigh, Edison picked up the muffins. "Fine, but if I get reported to building management for being a creep, I'm blaming you." Oscar made a sound that almost resembled a chuckle. Edison found himself standing outside apartment 2B, staring at the plain white door, while clutching the box of muffins. He could hear faint music from inside, something classical, perhaps Chopin. Before he could second-guess himself further, he knocked. The music stopped abruptly. There was a long pause before he heard cautious footsteps approaching the door. A security chain rattled, and the door opened just a few inches. A woman with dark hair and guarded eyes peered through the gap. "Yes?" Her voice was soft but tense. Edison held up the muffins, forcing a smile he did not feel. "Hi, I am Edison from 3A. I just wanted to welcome you to the building." The lie felt awkward on his tongue. The woman stared at him with unconcealed suspicion. "How did you know I just moved in?" Edison fumbled for an explanation. "I noticed the moving van last week." "There was no moving van," she replied flatly. "I came with 2 suitcases." Edison's mind raced. Oscar had led him into a conversational trap. "I'm sorry, I must have confused you with someone else. I travel a lot for work, and I just assumed... Anyway, would you like a muffin? They're a blueberry." Something in his flustered apology seemed to soften her wariness. After a moment's hesitation, she closed the door to remove the security chain, then opened it wider. Edison could now see she was dressed simply in jeans and a loose sweater that seemed a size too large. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, highlighting the delicate features of her face. She would have been strikingly beautiful if not for the shadows under her eyes and the tense set of her shoulders. "I'm Julia," she said, accepting the box with a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "That's unexpectedly kind of you." "Just being neighborly," Edison replied, relieved that she hadn't slammed the door in his face. Julia glanced over her shoulder, as if checking whether they were alone before turning back to him. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I should probably be more social, getting to know the neighbors and all that." The invitation surprised Edison. He had expected a brief, awkward exchange at the door, not an invitation inside. "I wouldn't want to intrude," he said. You are really not intruding, Julia insisted, though there was something almost desperate in her tone. Please, I could use the company. Edison hesitated only briefly before nodding. Coffee sounds great. Julia E.'s apartment was sparsely furnished, as if she hadn't fully moved in yet. There were no personal touches, no photos, no art on the walls, nothing that spoke of personality or history. The living room contained only a small sofa, a coffee table, and a bookshelf with a handful of paperbacks. The kitchen, visible through an open doorway, seemed similarly minimal. Make yourself comfortable, Julia said, gesturing to the sofa while she headed to the kitchen. The place is still a work in progress. It is nice, Edison lied politely, settling onto the sofa. Very streamlined. Julia laughed softly as she prepared the coffee. That's a kind way of saying empty. She paused, her back to him. I left in a hurry, didn't bring much with me. The statement hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken implications. Edison recalled Oscar S. words. She's afraid of her husband. He chose his next words carefully. Sometimes a fresh start is good, he offered. Helps you figure out what you really need. Julia returned with 2 mugs of coffee and sat on the opposite end of the sofa, keeping a careful distance between them. Is that what you were doing? A fresh start? Edison was startled by the question. What makes you think I'm starting fresh? She gestured vaguely toward his left hand. No ring, but there's a tan line, recent I'm guessing. And you have that look. What look? He asked, self-consciously covering his ring finger with his right hand. Like you, we're still figuring out who you are without someone else, she replied, then immediately looked embarrassed. I'm sorry, that was presumptuous. I don't usually psychoanalyze strangers. Edison smiled genuinely this time. No, you're right. Divorce about 6 months ago. Still adjusting. Julia nodded, sipping her coffee. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. They fell into surprisingly easy conversation after that, carefully circling around personal details while discussing safer topics. Books they'd read, movies they had seen, the quirks of the apartment building. Julia gradually relaxed, her smile becoming more frequent and genuine. Edison found himself charmed by her quick wit and thoughtful observations. It was only when they heard the sound of a key in the lock that everything changed. Julia E.'s face drained of color. She stood abruptly, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug. You need to go, she whispered urgently. Now, please. Before Edison could react, the door swung open. A man stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He was impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. His handsome face might have been pleasant if not for the cold calculation in his eyes as they moved from Julia to Edison. Sorry, dear, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Did I interrupt something? Robert, Julia's voice was barely audible. I didn't expect you today. Robert smiled, but the expression didn't touch his eyes. Clearly, he turned his attention to Edison. And you are? Edison stood, extending his hand automatically. Edison Walker. I live upstairs in 3A. I was just welcoming Julia to the building. Robert ignored the outstretched hand. How neighborly. His gaze flicked to the muffin box on the coffee table, and bearing gifts, no less. The tension in the room was suffocating. Julia stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. Edison slowly lowered his hand. I should be going, he said, moving toward the door. Thanks for the coffee, Julia. Nice to meet you, Robert. Robert didn't move from the doorway, forcing Edison to edge around him. As he passed, Robert spoke in a voice too low for Julia to hear. She's my wife, remember that. The threat was unmistakable, though nothing in his polite smile betrayed it. Edison nodded stiffly and stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind him with a decisive click. He stood in the corridor for a moment, heart pounding. Through the door he could hear the murmur of voices. Robert S. low and controlled, Julia S. barely audible. There was no shouting, no sounds of violence, yet Edison felt certain that something very wrong was happening in apartment 2B. When he returned to his own apartment, Oscar was waiting, perched expectantly at the edge of his cage. Her husband has a key, Edison said immediately. He showed up while I was there. I think I think you might be right about her being afraid. Oscar bobbed his head. Robert Miller keeps her isolated, controls her money, tracks her phone. Edison sank into a chair. How could you possibly know all that? I listen, Oscar replied simply. Windows open, words carry. Edison frowned. You can hear conversations from other apartments. When it is quiet, when they speak loudly. Oscar tilted his head. Patricia taught me to listen, to remember. Edison thought about this. The building AS ventilation system was old, and sound sometimes traveled strangely through the ducts. It was conceivable that a bird with exceptional hearing might catch fragments of conversations from nearby apartments. But that didn't explain everything, like how Oscar had known about the conference in Philadelphia, or about Edison's ex-wife's accusations regarding a woman named Natalie. Why tell me about Julia? Edison asked. Sir, what am I supposed to do with this information? Someone should know, Oscar replied. Someone should watch. Over the next few days, Edison found himself paying much closer attention to his surroundings. He began to notice patterns in the comings and goings of apartment 2B. Robert Miller appeared sporadically, always immaculately dressed, always with that cold, calculating look in his eyes. He never stayed overnight, but his visits lasted hours. After he left, Julia would not emerge from the apartment for the rest of the day. Edison started taking Oscar out of his cage more often, allowing the parrot to perch near the window or on the back of a chair. Oscar seemed to enjoy these freedoms, often sitting quietly for hours watching and listening. Sometimes he would mimic sounds from outside, car alarms, sirens, snippets of passing conversations, but more unsettlingly, he would occasionally repeat phrases that seemed to come from within the building. Stop checking my phone, Robert. The money is gone. Where is the money? You promised this time would be different. Edison couldn't be certain these were actual conversations he was overhearing, or if Oscar was somehow fabricating them. The distinction became increasingly blurred and increasingly irrelevant as his concern for Julia grew. One evening, as Edison was reviewing work documents at his desk, Oscar suddenly became agitated, flapping his wings and pacing on his perch. Glass breaking, the parrot said urgently. 2B, glass breaking. Edison strained to listen but heard nothing. Are you sure? Help her, Oscar insisted, his agitation growing. Now. Edison hesitated. What if Oscar was wrong? What if he went charging down there only to find Julia and Robert having a perfectly normal evening? He'd look like a fool at best, a stalker at worst. But what if Oscar was right? The memory of Julia's face when Robert entered the apartment decided him. He grabbed his phone and headed for the door. As he approached apartment 2B, he still heard nothing unusual. He stood outside the door, listening intently. Should he knock, call someone? Just as he was about to press his ear to the door, it opened suddenly. Robert stepped out, adjusting his tie. He seemed startled to find Edison in the hallway, but quickly composed himself. Ah, the friendly neighbor, he said smoothly. Lurking in hallways now, are we? Edison struggled to keep his expression neutral. I thought I heard something break, wanted to make sure everything was okay. Your concern is touching if misplaced, Robert replied with a cold smile. Julia dropped a glass. Nothing dramatic. He brushed past Edison without another word, heading for the stairwell. Edison waited until he heard the door to the street level close before he knocked gently on Julia's door. Julia? It's Edison. Are you all right? There was no response. He knocked again, slightly louder. Julia? The door opened a crack, the security chain in place. Julia's eye appeared in the gap, red-rimmed and wary. Edison? What are you doing here? I heard something break. I wanted to check on you. I'm fine, she said quickly. Just clumsy, dropped a wineglass. But Edison had caught a glimpse of her cheek through the gap in the door. A darkening bruise was forming just below her right eye. Julia, he said quietly, let me in, please. There was a long pause before the door closed, the chain rattled and then the door opened wider. Julia stood before him, one hand pressed to her cheek, trying unsuccessfully to hide the bruise. It is not what you think, she began, but her voice cracked on the last word. Edison stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The apartment was in disarray. unlike the neat space he'd seen before. A broken wine glass lay in shards near the wall, as if it had been thrown rather than dropped. Julia's phone lay on the coffee table, its screen shattered. "He did this," Edison said. It wasn't a question. Julia turned away, moving to the kitchen where she retrieved a broom and dustpan. "I should clean this up," she said, ignoring his statement. Edison gently took the broom from her hands. "You don't have to protect him." "You don't understand, Anne," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is not always like this, and he has resources, connections. I can just leave." "You already left once," Edison pointed out. "You came here." Julia's eyes widened. "How did you know that?" Edison hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Just a guess," he said finally. "You mentioned leaving in a hurry, not bringing much with you." She studied him for a moment, then seemed to accept his explanation. "I did leave, and he found me anyway. He always does." As Edison helped her clean up the broken glass, Julia gradually revealed more about her situation. Robert Miller was a successful investment banker with powerful friends, including several in law enforcement. Their marriage had seemed perfect at first. He was charming, attentive, generous. It was only after they were married that his controlling nature emerged. He monitored everything: my phone, my computer, my spending, my friends. If I did anything he did not approve of, there were consequences. She touched her bruised cheek unconsciously. "I tried to leave once before, stayed with my sister." He showed up at her house perfectly composed, with flowers and apologies. When she left us alone to talk, he told me if I didn't come home with him, he'd ruin her husband's career. "That is blackmail," Edison said, horrified. Julia gave a bitter laugh. "That is Robert. He does not make idle threats. Have you considered going to the police?" "With what evidence? My word against his. Besides," she added quietly, "his college roommate is a captain in the local precinct. They play golf together every month." As the evening progressed, Edison learned more about Julia's precarious situation. Robert had frozen their joint accounts. He controlled her credit cards. The apartment was in his name, as was her cell phone plan. She had been systematically isolated from friends and family through Robert's subtle manipulations and outright threats. "Why did he let you move here?" Edison asked. "If he is so controlling?" "He didn't let me," Julia replied. "I ran, again. But now he's found me, and he is making it clear that I am still his wife, still his property. The only reason he doesn't is simply drag me back home is appearances. Robert is obsessed with how things look to others." Before Edison left that night, he gave Julia his phone number, writing it on a slip of paper rather than programming it into her damaged phone. "If you need anything, anything at all, call me or come upstairs." She took the paper with a sad smile. "Thank you, but please don't get involved. Robert is dangerous when he feels challenged." Edison returned to his apartment, troubled by everything he'd learned. Oscar was waiting on his perch, watching the door expectantly. "You were right," Edison told the bird, still unsettled by Oscar's uncanny awareness. "Her husband is abusive. She's trapped, and I don't know how to help her." Oscar tilted his head. "Evidence," he said clearly. "Need evidence. What kind of evidence?" "She says he was careful. He has connections with the police." "Not all police," Oscar replied. "Not all friends." Edison considered this. "You think we need to find someone in law enforcement who isn't connected to Robert?" Oscar bobbed his head in what seemed like agreement. "And what evidence?" "Julia says it as her word against his." Oscar flew from his perch to the windowsill, looking down at the street below. "He comes back. Tomorrow. Always checks her phone. Always gets angry." A chill ran down Edison's spine. "How do you know he is coming back tomorrow?" "Heard him say before leaving." Oscar tilted his head. "I'll check on you tomorrow. Don't try anything stupid." Edison paced the apartment, thinking. If Robert was coming back tomorrow and would likely become aggressive again, perhaps there was a way to document it. But how? Julia couldn't record him. Her phone was broken, and even if it wasn't Robert checked it regularly. An idea began to form in Edison's mind. It was risky, potentially even dangerous. But if it worked, It might give Julia the leverage she needed to escape Robert S. control. He looked at Oscar, still perched by the window. "I need a recording device," he said, half to himself. Something small, something he would not notice. Oscar's head bobbed again, as if in approval of the plan. Edison didn't sleep much that night. He spent hours researching options online, finally ordering a small, discreet recording device that would be delivered by expedited shipping the next morning. He also researched domestic violence resources in the area, looking especially for legal advocates who might help navigate the complexities of Julia's situation. By the time dawn broke, casting long shadows across his apartment, Edison had formulated a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it carried significant risks, but doing nothing seemed far worse. What Edison couldn't know was that events were already in motion that would escalate the situation beyond anything he had anticipated. Robert Miller's control over Julia was more tenuous than it appeared, and his desperate attempts to maintain that control would soon push him to take drastic action. And through it all, Oscar would continue to watch and listen, his extraordinary abilities becoming the key to unraveling a mystery far deeper than a troubled marriage. The next morning, Edison paced nervously in his apartment, waiting for the delivery of the recording device. Oscar watched from his perch, unusually quiet. "What if this doesn't work?" Edison asked aloud. "What if I make things worse for her?" "Doing nothing is worse," Oscar replied, his voice solemn. "Patricia always said that." Edison paused, struck again by the mention of Oscar's former owner. "Tell me more about Patricia," he said, realizing he knew almost nothing about the woman who had trained this extraordinary bird. Oscar tilted his head, as if considering the request. Patricia saw people, really saw them, helped them see themselves. He shuffled on his perch. "She knew I was watching, listening, taught me what to look for." "And what do you look for?" Edison asked. "Pain," Oscar said simply. "Fear, lies, truth, hiding underneath." The doorbell interrupted their conversation. The package had arrived. Inside was a device smaller than Edison's palm, a voice-activated recorder with enough battery life to operate for days. Now he just needed to find a way to place it in Julia's apartment without Robert discovering it. An opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. As Edison was considering his options, a soft knock came at his door. Julia stood in the hallway, her bruise now partially concealed with makeup. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said quietly. "But Robert called. He is coming over earlier than expected, and She hesitated. "I don't want to be alone when he arrives." Edison invited her in, immediately noticing how her eyes widened at the sight of Oscar. The parrot stared back at her intently. "This is Oscar," Edison explained. "He's unusual." Julia approached the cage cautiously. "He's beautiful." "Robert checks your phone," Oscar said suddenly, causing Julia to jump back in surprise. "Breaks things when angry." Color drained from Julia's face. "How does he know that?" she whispered to Edison. "Oscar knows a lot of things he shouldn't, Edison replied honestly. "I am still trying to figure it out myself." Julia studied the parrot with new wariness. "What else does he know?" "Sister in Boston," Oscar continued, his head bobbing. "Husband named David. Robert threatened his job." Julia sank into a chair, visibly shaken. "I never told you any of that," she said to Edison. "I mentioned my sister, but not where she lives, not her husband's name, not what Robert did." "I know," Edison said gently. "Oscar seems to gather information somehow. The previous owner was a therapist. She apparently trained him to be exceptionally observant." Julia looked back at Oscar, who was now preening his feathers, as if he hadn't just revealed impossibly specific details about her life. "That's more than observation," she murmured. Edison decided to take a risk. He showed Julia the recording device, explaining his plan. "If we can document Robert's behavior, his threats, his admissions of past abuse, it might give you leverage, especially with authorities who aren't in his pocket." Julia stared at the small device. "It's risky," she said finally. "If he finds it, he won not Edison assured her, though he wasn't entirely confident. We'll place it somewhere he'd never look. After considering her options, Julia agreed. Together they returned to her apartment, where Edison discreetly placed the recorder inside a decorative vase on a high shelf, somewhere Robert was unlikely to notice or disturb. "When will he be here?" Edison asked as they finished. Julia checked her watch. "About an hour. He said he wanted to take me to dinner, to discuss our situation." "I don't like the sound of that." Edison frowned. "Be careful. If anything feels wrong, find a way to leave. Come to my apartment if you need to." Julia nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't believe escape would be that simple. Edison reluctantly returned to his own apartment, leaving Julia to prepare for Robert S.'s arrival. Oscar was waiting by the window, unusually agitated. "I don't like leaving her alone down there," Edison told the Parrot. "Not right," Oscar agreed, pacing on his perch. Something not right. As the hour approached when Robert was expected to arrive, Edison became increasingly uneasy. Oscar's agitation had only grown, the bird repeatedly flying to the door, then back to the window. "What is it?" Edison asked. "What was wrong?" "Car," Oscar said urgently. "A black car, not his usual." Edison hurried to the window. A black sedan with tinted windows had parked directly in front of the building, not Robert's usual silver luxury car. Two men emerged, neither of them Robert. They entered the building without buzzing any apartments. A sense of dread washed over Edison. "Those men," he said to Oscar, "are they going to Julia's apartment?" Oscar bobbed his head vigorously. "Not friends," he warned. "Not police. Dangerous." Edison didn't stop to question how Oscar could know this. He grabbed his phone and ran for the door. As he reached the stairwell, he heard Julia's door opening one floor below. There was a brief exchange of voices, then silence. Moving cautiously, Edison descended to the second floor and peered around the corner. Julia's door was closed again. He could hear muffled voices inside, but couldn't make out the words. He retreated to the stairwell, trying to decide what to do. Call the police? But what would he say? That two men had entered an apartment they had apparently been given access to? That his Parrot thought they were dangerous? Before he could decide, he heard Julia's door open again. Pressing himself against the wall, he watched as the two men emerged, escorting Julia between them. She wasn't struggling, but her face was pale with fear. One man gripped her elbow firmly as they guided her toward the stairwell. The same stairwell where Edison was hidden. He scrambled upward, reaching his own floor just as they started ascending. Through the crack of the closing door, he saw them leading Julia up rather than down, heading toward the roof access. Edison rushed back to his apartment, where Oscar was flying in agitated circles. "They were taking her to the roof," he gasped. "I need to call the police." "Robert sent them," Oscar said, landing on the back of a chair. "Evidence. Need the evidence." Edison hesitated only briefly before making a decision. He dashed into Julia's apartment, retrieving the hidden recording device. Then, using the stairs at the opposite end of the building, he made his way to the roof access door. The door was slightly ajar. Edging it open, Edison could see the two men standing with Julia near the edge of the roof. One was speaking on a phone, his voice low and urgent. "We have her," the man was saying. "Yes, sir. Understood." Julia caught sight of Edison, and her eyes widened in alarm. She gave a slight shake of her head, warning him away. Edison retreated, his mind racing. The recording device in his pocket suddenly seemed inadequate against the reality of what was happening. He needed more help. He called 911, reporting a possible kidnapping in progress on the roof of his building. Then, driven by a desperate need to do something, he returned to his apartment, where Oscar was waiting by the open window. "Help is coming," Edison told the bird. "But I don't know if they'll get here in time." Oscar stared at him intently. "Patricia had a gun," he said clearly. "Locked box, under desk." Edison froze. "What are you saying?" "Protection," Oscar replied. "Sometimes needed." Edison had never owned a gun, had never even held one. But Oscar's words reminded him of something. The previous tenant had been a retired security consultant. What if... He moved to the desk in the corner, the one piece of furniture he had purchased used from the building's super. Kneeling, he examined the underside, There, attached with aging duct tape, was a small lockbox. The combination lock required 4 digits. Edison looked at Oscar helplessly. "I don't have the code." Oscar bobbed his head. 7392. Edison's hands shook as he input the numbers. The lockbox opened, revealing a small handgun and a box of ammunition. He lifted the weapon gingerly, noting that it was loaded. "I cannot use this," he whispered, more to himself than to Oscar. "I don't know how." "Last resort," Oscar said. "Show only if needed." With profound reluctance, Edison secured the gun in his jacket pocket. Its weight felt alien and terrifying against his side. He hoped desperately that he wouldn't need to use it or even show it. When he returned to the roof, the situation had escalated. Robert had arrived, stepping out of a helicopter that now sat at the center of the roof. He was speaking to Julia, his expression cold and calculating. Edison crouched behind a large air conditioning unit, straining to hear their conversation over the idling helicopter. "Thought you could just walk away," Robert was saying. "After everything I've built, everything I've done for you." "You've done nothing but control and hurt me," Julia replied, her voice stronger than Edison had expected. "I want a divorce, Robert. I want my life back." Robert laughed, the sound chilling even from a distance. "There is no your life anymore, Julia. There is only our life, the one I've created, and if you can't appreciate that." He gestured toward the edge of the roof. A cold realization washed over Edison. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was something far worse. Robert Miller was planning to make his wife disappear. In that moment, sirens became audible in the distance. Robert's head snapped up, his expression hardening. He turned to his men. "We need to move, now." One of the men grabbed Julia roughly, pulling her toward the helicopter. She struggled, finally finding the courage to resist openly. Edison knew he had to act. The police wouldn't arrive in time. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out from his hiding place. "Let her go, Robert," he called over the noise of the helicopter. Robert turned, his surprise quickly replaced by cold fury. "The neighborly Mr. Walker," he sneered. "This doesn't concern you." "I've called the police," Edison said, moving closer. "They know what is happening here." "And what exactly do they know?" Robert asked, his voice dangerously calm. "That a concerned husband is retrieving his troubled wife. That is all they will see, all they all believe." "They all believe the evidence," Edison replied, withdrawing the recording device from his pocket. "Everything you've said, everything you've done, it is all documented." Robert's expression flickered briefly with uncertainty before settling back into confident disdain. "Hand it over," he demanded, gesturing to one of his men to approach Edison. Edison backed away, keeping the device held high. "It is already backed up," he lied. "To my cloud account. The police have the access code." The approaching man hesitated, looking to Robert for direction. In that moment of uncertainty, a strange sound cut through the air. A perfect imitation of a police radio followed by a commanding voice. "All units in position, roof secured, move in on my signal." Everyone froze, looking around for the source of the transmission. Edison recognized it immediately as Oscar's voice, but the precision of the mimicry had the others convinced that police officers were already on the roof, hidden and ready to act. Robert's confidence visibly wavered. "Check the stairwells," he ordered his men, both of them. As the two men moved to investigate, Robert turned his attention back to Julia. "This isn't over," he said, grabbing her arm. "We're leaving, now." Edison saw his chance slipping away. The recording device wasn't enough. The police might not arrive in time, and if Robert managed to force Julia into that helicopter, his hand moved to his pocket, feeling the weight of the gun. He had never imagined himself in this position, had never wanted to threaten another human being. But Julia's life was at stake. Just as he was about to withdraw the weapon, another voice spoke, not from the stairwells or the helicopter, but from directly above them. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Miller." Everyone looked up. Perched on the edge of a maintenance structure was Oscar, his grey feathers ruffled by the wind, his crimson tail vivid against the darkening sky. "What the—" Robert began, but Oscar cut him off. "Robert Anthony Miller, the Parrot said, his voice unnervingly clear over the helicopter noise. Born in Lakeside. Mother's name Angela. Father left when you were 7. First arrest at 16. Assault charges dropped. Second arrest at 20. Domestic violence against girlfriend Melissa Torres. Charges dropped again. Family connections useful. Robert had gone pale. How could it possibly know these things? He whispered, his grip on Julia loosening. Oscar continued, as if reciting from an invisible file. Offshore accounts in Cayman Islands. Money from investors diverted. SEC investigating quietly. Paper trail leads to personal accounts and properties. Edison was as stunned as Robert. This went far beyond overhearing conversations or observing behavior. This was knowledge that couldn't possibly be explained by Oscar's location in the apartment building. Shut that thing up, Robert ordered, recovering somewhat from his shock. He turned to the pilot. Start the pre-flight, we're relieving now. But Oscar wasn't a tea finished. Julia, not the first wife. Catherine Davis died in fall from balcony, ruled accident, wasn't a tea accident. Robert's face contorted with rage and fear. Lies, he shouted, releasing Julia entirely to move toward Oscar. All lies! In that moment of distraction, Julia ran to Edison's side. The helicopter's engine roared louder as the pilot prepared for takeoff. The 2 men Robert had sent to check the stairwells returned, looking confused. No police, one reported, but we heard vehicles arriving outside. Robert turned back to Julia and Edison, his composure completely gone. This isn't over, see, he threatened, backing toward the helicopter. I'll find you both. You will regret this. As he climbed into the helicopter, Oscar flew down from his perch, landing on Edison's shoulder. The bird's presence, combined with the growing sound of police sirens and the knowledge that his secrets were somehow exposed, seemed to finalize Robert's decision to flee. The helicopter lifted off, carrying Robert and his men away just as the roof access door burst open and police officers spilled out, weapons drawn. In the chaos that followed, Julia clung to Edison's arm, her face buried against his shoulder. Oscar remained perched nearby, watching everything with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold countless secrets. The investigation that unfolded over the following weeks revealed the full extent of Robert Miller's crimes. The recording device had captured his threats on the roof, providing crucial evidence. But it was the specific information Oscar had somehow known, about offshore accounts, about a previous wife's suspicious death, that led investigators to uncover the darker truth. Robert Miller was indeed under SEC investigation for financial fraud. His business empire was built on stolen investments and money laundering. And most disturbingly, his first wife's death, ruled an accident, was reopened as a potential homicide after investigators found inconsistencies in the original reports. Robert himself had vanished. The helicopter had been found abandoned at a small private airfield, but he had reportedly boarded a private plane, bound for a country without extradition treaties with the United States. International warrants were issued for his arrest. Julia, finally free from her husband's control, began the slow process of rebuilding her life. With the help of a legal team that specialized in cases like hers, she gained access to accounts Robert hadn't been able to hide or empty. The divorce proceeded in his absence, with the courts overwhelmingly ruling in her favor. Through it all, Edison and Oscar remained constant presences in her life. The friendship that had begun with a box of muffins gradually deepened into something more meaningful. As for Oscar, the mystery of his knowledge remained. Edison had countless theories that the bird had somehow been present during conversations no one knew about, that he had been trained more extensively than anyone realized, that he possessed some form of intelligence beyond human understanding. But none fully explained the extent and specificity of what Oscar knew. One evening, as Edison and Julia sat together in his apartment, watching Oscar preen his feathers in the last light of sunset, Julia asked the question that had been on both their minds. "What is he, really?" Edison shook his head. "I don't know. I've tried to find information about his previous owner, this Patricia he mentions, but it's like she never existed. No records, no therapy practice under that name, nothing. Maybe that is not her real name, Julia suggested. That maybe it as what she called herself with him. Oscar watched them, tilting his head as if following their conversation with perfect comprehension. And perhaps he was. Whatever or whoever he is, Edison said finally, he saved your life. He changed everything. And no one wanted him, Julia marveled. All those families returned him because they couldn't handle his abilities. Their loss, Edison smiled, reaching out to gently stroke Oscar's feathers. Some truths are worth the discomfort they cause. Oscar bobbed his head as if in agreement. Truth sets free, he said clearly. Patricia always said that. Over time, Edison and Julia created a new life together, one built on honesty and mutual support, rather than fear and control. They moved to a house near the edge of town, with large windows and open spaces where Oscar could fly freely. Julia started a foundation to help survivors of domestic abuse, using her own experience, and Robert S. frozen assets to create safe houses and legal aid programs. Her work helped countless women find the freedom and security she had been denied for so long. Edison continued his career, but with newfound balance, never allowing work to consume him the way it had during his first marriage. He also began chronicling Oscar's unusual abilities, documenting the bird's insights and apparent knowledge without trying to explain them. And Oscar, he continued to watch, to listen, to occasionally share truths that seemed impossible for him to know, but he did so in a home where truth was valued rather than feared, where his peculiar gifts were seen as blessings rather than burdens. The mystery of how a parrot could know so much remained unsolved. Perhaps it would always be so. But the impact of those knowledge, the lives saved, the justice served, the healing made possible, was beyond question. In the end, Oscar wasn't just a parrot no one wanted. He was exactly where he needed to be, with people who needed him. And in that perfect alignment of need and purpose, perhaps lay the greatest truth of all, that sometimes the most unlikely sources of wisdom are the ones we need most desperately to hear. Late one night, as moonlight spilled across the bedroom where Edison and Julia slept peacefully, Oscar perched by the window, his eyes reflecting the silver light. He spoke softly, though no one was awake to hear him. "Mission complete, Patricia," he said, in a voice somehow different from his usual mimicry. "Found them, helped them, just like you said." And somewhere in the vast unknown from which Oscar's impossible knowledge seemed to come, perhaps Patricia, whoever or whatever she might have been, heard him and was satisfied. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.